What's really happening to the Rohingya? There's been an international chorus of condemnation of the violence being carried out against them, but the government of Myanmar insists the crisis is now improving. Al-Jazeera has been on this story.
Today we're live on YouTube and we'll be taking your questions for Al-Jazeera journalists about all the latest developments. Here's Al-Jazeera's Nicholas Hawk.
We're just a stone's throw away from Myanmar's Rakhine state. It's across this road, across the Naf River. This is where the Myanmar government has been doing what it's calling a clearing operation. That, they say, is now over. But we continue to see villages burning from the Bangladesh side of the border. And every day, hundreds of Rohingyas continue to flee across the border. No one really knows what's going on in the Rakhine state because that area is restricted to both journalists and human rights activists. But we do have the tales of people coming across the border. I met a Rohingya Hindu woman who saw her husband being shot down by masked men. She then saw her relatives being raped and then stabbed and then dumped into mass graves. I met a young 10-year-old girl, Fatima Begum. Her home was set ablaze. Her parents were inside. She survived, walked through the night to come across the border here in Bangladesh. This is the hardest part of Fatima Begum's day. She's going to have to compete with all these women and men who are queuing here in order to get a small bag of rice and lentil. That's going to be her only meal of the day if she managed to get some relief. Many of the Rohingyas that I speak to here, though, say they want to go back to Myanmar. They say that the Rakhine state is their homeland, and it's been like this for centuries. And so despite the horrors that they've gone through, most of the people that I speak to here want to go back home.
The United Nations General Assembly is underway in New York, and the issue of the Rohingya has been high on the agenda after the world body accused the government of Myanmar of ethnic cleansing. This most recent flare-up came after security forces and allied militias retaliated to a series of attacks by a small Muslim armed group in the Rakhine state. As you just saw in Nicholas's reporting, Rohingya have been streaming across the border into neighboring Bangladesh. Well, on Tuesday, Myanmar State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, broke a long silence with an internationally televised address. Referring to the flight of about 400,000 Rohingya from the country as an exodus, she did not condemn her government's military operations.
This satellite imagery released by Human Rights Watch on Monday shows the destruction of more than 200 villages and tens of thousands of homes in Rakhine State in Myanmar. Al Jazeera's Divya Gopalan also reported on the story earlier this month.
That is the last Bangladeshi border security post. And beyond that, where you see the smoke billowing, is Myanmar. Now, the journey between the two countries is just a boat ride across the river that takes 20 minutes, which is why we've seen dozens of Rohingya who made it to the safety of Bangladesh trying to go back to save family members they've left behind.
Well, Divya joins us now from Hong Kong. UN correspondent Rosalind Jordan is at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. And in Doha, Hassan Patel is the head of Al Jazeera's online planning. Welcome to the stream, everyone. Let's start at the UN, where world leaders have almost ensured the Rohingya issue was placed at the top of the agenda. Take a look at this.
The authorities in Myanmar must end the military operations, allow unhindered humanitarian access, and recognize the right of refugees to return in safety and dignity. And they must also address the grievances of the Rohingya.
The Rohingyas, more than 400,000 refugees, the majority of them children. Military operations there must cease. Access to humanitarian aid must be provided, and the rule of law must be re-established. Because, as we all know, we are dealing with ethnic cleansing here. France will be making a relevant initiative within the Security Council to that effect.
The Myanmar crisis is very reminiscent of what happened in Bosnia in 1995 and in Rwanda in 1994.
Roz, what does the reaction to those comments look like?
Well, there's growing horror to what is happening to the Rohingya people as they are fleeing their homes in Rakhine State and trying to find safety across the western border into Bangladesh. There is a real sense that this community has been much maligned, much discriminated against, and now is being targeted by the government in Yangon with what many are feeling is the tacit approval of Aung San Suu Kyi, the state counselor. Of course, as some of our viewers may know, she can't be the official leader because her late husband and her 2 children are not citizens of Myanmar, and so she's not allowed to actually be the president or the prime minister. That said, there are many people here at the United Nations who feel that she is missing an opportunity to demonstrate her moral clarity by not condemning the military attacks, and that comes even though the United States is saying that the military in Myanmar should stop its attacks on the Rohingya and should try to move very quickly to a political resolution of this crisis.
So Roz, talking also about the humanitarian crisis that's going on, I want to bring Divya into the conversation because Divya, you were just in Bangladesh. Take a look at this question we got from a viewer in South Africa. Bengai wants to know, what has the Bangladesh government done to help the Rohingya Muslim refugees? Divya, you were just in Bangladesh. What was the government's response like to these hundreds of thousands of people who have crossed the border in the last month?
You know, that's a very good question. When we were on the ground, we barely saw any type of government relief or any type of government help. What we saw were loads of aid agencies and local charities who just motivated themselves to go and feed people, give out food and relief. And unfortunately, while it was effective to a certain extent, what you basically saw was lots of trucks, as we saw in Nicholas Huck's report, where they throw out food. So the food isn't being distributed properly. The relief isn't getting to most people, just to a very small few who happen to be able to physically be where those trucks happen to be at that time. As far as what the government is doing, quite honestly, it's very hard to tell. They promised relief many times when we were there. In fact, the Prime Minister had come and visited the camps, had once again promised reliefs. But a couple of days after that, it was still not visible exactly what kind of relief they were giving or what kind of help they were trying to give people. So as far as the Bangladeshi government goes, if you want to talk about physical relief or physical help, you can't see it. It's not visible. But what the Bangladeshi government has admitted is that it's overwhelmed. They can't cope with the number of people. So they have, in so many words, said that this is too much for them. They also said that they are relying on charities and NGOs to help fill the gap where international agencies haven't been able to do it, or even the government hasn't been able to come forward with.
Speaking, of course, of Bangladesh, what it actually looks like for people when they cross the border is one of the things that Al-Jazeera's reporters have been trying to really show for our audiences who are asking for this. I want to take a look at what it looks like in a refugee camp. Now, this is sent to us by Saif Khalid. He is an Al Jazeera online reporter, and he gives us a view of what people are going through. Have a look.
I'm at Kutupalong refugee camp in Cox's Bazar. Aid agencies are saying that the sheer volume of refugee numbers have been overwhelming. They have been struggling to provide basic amenities such as sanitation, food, and shelter. And in the past couple of days, torrential rains has meant that many of the refugee camps, and most of the Rohingya refugees are living in unregistered camps. The rains have flooded many of them, and as a result, the refugees had to move to new shelters.
Hassan, what is it that you've been hearing from the reporters that you've sent out who are on the ground and doing this reporting, who are on that border?
Well, Malika, we sent Saif Khalid and Shaukat Shafi last Friday, and they've been there for a week. And they've been filing in reports every day, looking at the situation of refugee camps, but also looking at the health problems. Hospitals are overwhelmed. One hospital that Saif visited, he couldn't even find doctors to look at the patients. One hospital worker told SAFE that there's a shortage of midwives because there are some heavily pregnant women coming from Myanmar. But also we found out from SAFE and Shaukat of the genuine problems many of these refugees are facing, of food, the lack of support, but not knowing where to go or what to do. Similarly, Shaukat filed a piece about various Hindu Rohingya refugees who are also crossing the border, and highlighting that this is not just about religion, but it's about a group of people who in one way are stateless, coming into another country where they actually can't afford to survive because there's just no support for them.
You know, actually you mentioned, Raz, go ahead.
Yeah, the point of the Rohingya being stateless, there are more than 160 ethnic minorities inside Myanmar, and yet for generations the Rohingya have not been able to get any state recognition that they are a legitimate resident community of Myanmar. In fact, they had been told in generations past that you need to leave, you need to go to Bangladesh, or what used to be India. You don't belong here. And so they are already facing this generational problem. But of course now, as you see, not just the military, but partisan groups who want to be in good stead with the military burning down their communities, it really beggars the question, how are these people supposed to prove that they were once residents of Myanmar if they want to go back and try to reclaim their homes and try to rebuild their lives? How can they make good on the promise of Aung San Suu Kyi that they can actually return home if everything they had has gone up in smoke in the last 2 months? It really does make you wonder, how serious is the government in Yangon to embrace the Rohingya and bring them back? Certainly there's a lot of pressure here at the UN. There was a closed-door meeting on Monday with top leaders from Yangon being pressured to style back on the military operations and to try to find a political solution. But really, what is the consequence if they don't do it? And this is something we're just not hearing at the UN yet.
Divya?
I just wanted to jump in with a very quick quote or a conversation I had with one of the refugees when it comes to being stateless, which helped me understand the whole idea of what it means to be stateless. He said to me, I'm a human being, I must belong somewhere, but I don't know where it is that I belong because nobody lets me belong anywhere. And I thought that was really poignant and helped you understand that this whole idea of statelessness, it's not just about not having papers, it's about belonging somewhere or having a home to go to, or knowing that you will be safe or there is somewhere you can be.
So talking about those individual stories, Hassan, I want to ask you a question actually, because an Al Jazeera reporter, Katie Arnold, actually filed a story. You can see it on my computer, Messages to the World from Rohingya Muslims, and it's individual stories. Hassan, let's listen to Katie talking about her work, and then I want to ask you about it. Take a listen to Katie Arnold, everybody.
One of the motivations behind the I Am Rohingya series was to put a human face behind the conflict and to humanise a news story that was really only known for its acts of inhumanity. Now, every day people would be tuning into the news and hearing that 200, 300 or 400,000 people were crossing the border from Myanmar into Bangladesh. But what about the impact on those individual lives? If one doesn't empathise with the Rohingya, then there's the risk that this will just turn into another of those tragedies that is taking place on the other side of the world, and that was something that I wanted to avoid. Now, one of the most powerful testimonies, and one that affected me most profoundly, was of 10-year-old Noor Kajol, who was going about her usual morning routine of brushing her teeth, washing her face, when her father was shot dead in front of her. Now, during the interview, she kept saying how much she missed her father, but there was one really touching moment where she described how her family crossed the Naf River, which divides Myanmar and Bangladesh, using a boat that had an engine, something that she'd never experienced before. But still, she could not enjoy the experience because her father was not there.
So Hassan, can you talk about why Al Jazeera commissioned this series of individual stories?
The reason why we commissioned these stories, and Katie did a really good job in painting these portraits of Noor Kajol, of Mohammed Hassan, of Hassan, who's 30 years old, of Abu Hayat, these individuals who We never heard of them a few days ago, but now we know who they are. And the reason is basically to paint a human story, but more importantly, to give a voice to the voiceless. That's what Al-Jazeera is about. We can talk about the politics of the UN, we can talk about Aung San Suu Kyi, and those are critical stories which we are covering as well. But we're putting a name to this particular situation. We're putting a name to an individual who's lost everything. Katie spoke about Hassan, who's 30 years old. He had to carry his sister, who was traumatized after she was about to be raped by soldiers. She put a picture of Muhammad, who saw his father be shot dead in the same way that Noor, was only 10 years old, who saw it as well. Now, what happens is this humanizes the story, and it allows people to understand the depth of this particular conflict, more importantly.
You know, Raz, one of the things that we hear from analysts is that, aside from the criticism of Aung San Suu Kyi, that she actually doesn't have that much power. And she, whether or not she came out and was more forceful with her statements regarding the Rohingya, there is someone behind her. What is the reaction among world leaders to that, and who is actually running the show and pulling the strings, and whether or not the military is being condemned?
Malika, that's a very, very good point, and that is something which diplomats have been stressing to journalists here at the UN for the past several weeks, especially once we all started asking, look at the people fleeing for their lives into Bangladesh. Their homes are being burned down, their livestock, their crops are being destroyed. What can the United Nations do? What can the Security Council do? And what diplomats have consistently been saying up until the last week or so is that we want to engage in behind-the-scenes diplomacy. We don't want to be doing it out here in front of all the cameras, in front of the entire world, because we know that Aung San Suu Kyi is in a particularly delicate position. She basically has her leadership post by the good graces of the military, which is still technically in charge, and we don't want to do anything to upset that political balance. So what these diplomats argue they have been doing is trying to have closed-door conversations, telephone conversations, in-person conversations with leaders of the Burmese government, whether they are from the mission here in New York or whether they are in other capitals around the world. They say that trying to have these discussions and trying to tell them that what they are doing is morally and legally wrong, they were hoping that this would actually lead to some sort of development. But what we saw in the past week was just a real sense of outrage among the international community that the people are still fleeing, that they're still fearing for their lives and their well-being, and that this is when you started seeing more pressure come up. It's worth pointing out that the closed-door meeting on Monday, which was chaired by the British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, was basically an opportunity for members of the Security Council to say to the Deputy National Security Advisor and the Deputy Prime Minister, you are in the wrong. You need to stop what you're doing. Now, it's a question of whether or not this kind of face-to-face tough love is actually then going to be moved into the Security Council chambers, because once that happens, there then is an expectation that the Security Council will actually call for some sort of action. That tends to be a last resort type of action, even though there are lots of incremental steps that can be built into it, but still, if this issue of Myanmar actually makes it into the Security Council chamber, now you're talking about potential sanctions, potential travel bans, potentially setting up some sort of investigative mechanism to hold people or institutions accountable for their behavior right now. This is all very serious stuff, and this is an area where they don't want to get there until they feel that it's necessary to get there.
So, Roz, we're getting comments on what the international community should do. I just want to read this quickly. This is Ibrahim, who just sent us this on YouTube. He said, why isn't Myanmar being taken to The Hague? But Divya, I want to go back to you with a question about reporting the story. The Watcher tweeted us and said, why is the government of Myanmar reluctant to give free access to the press to troubled areas? Divya, could you talk about how the government is controlling access to Rakhine State?
Yeah, I think the easy answer to that is because they don't want people to see what's going on in Rakhine State. you know, if you ask from the people I spoke to in the refugee camps, what's going on there is just horrific. The type of torture they're going through, the kind of abuse they're under, not only from the military, but from mobs, also from neighboring villages. And it is just carnage. And giving journalists that kind of access to see what's going on is really, really going to open up Myanmar and make it so visible, the kind of persecution that these people are going through. So that would be the number one reason why the government isn't giving them any access. But as far as trying to understand what is going on there, you could just listen to the people's stories at the camps itself, and it is just, there's just so much consistency in everything they say. They all corroborate with each other. It doesn't matter which camp you go to. So it's really, really hard to not believe what they're saying or even doubt the validity of what it is they're saying that's going on there.
I wanted to share just a couple of comments we're getting from online, because people are watching you have this conversation and have their own thoughts to add. This is Layla. She says, I expected the lady to have compassion considering she was in exile for years. This is likely a comment on Suu Kyi, although she was in house arrest for years, not necessarily exile. This is another comment from Osman on Twitter. International community needs to do more to pressure the Myanmar government to stop the killing of innocent people because of their belief. And I want to pivot just a little bit, though, to some of our reporting from Shaukat Shafi. He's the photographer for Al-Jazeera Online that Hassan, you mentioned a little bit earlier. And it's this headline here that really caught all of our eyes. He says, they look at us with hope, but we can only document their despair. And he writes and details what it's like to be a photojournalist, capturing these moments of people and what that feels like, because at the end of the day, the reporters go home. Here's what he told the stream.
Hi, I'm Shaukat Shafi. I have been covering Rohingya refugee crisis from last 1 week now. The situation is very bad over here. There are thousands and thousands of people walking around looking for food and looking for shelter. Everyone has a painful story to share. On my second day of my assignment, I was on the border. I saw a little boy taking care of his unconscious baby sister. They had lost their father in Myanmar and they had got separated from their mother while crossing over to Bangladesh. When I took the picture of the unconscious baby, something broke inside me. It was hard, very hard for me.
Hassan?
Saif and Shaukat have done a remarkable job. The stress that both have been under has been immense as well, and I think their work speaks volumes. Shaukat saw that particular incident of people taking pictures of this one young Rohingya refugee that we asked him to write something, but we didn't expect it to be so powerful. But I think, again, sometimes with events like this, we sometimes fail to look at the reality of what's happening on the ground. And I think what Shaukat did, what all our journalists have done, Divya as well, Florence in Myanmar, is that we've highlighted the suffering and the pain that individuals are going through. Because I've just done some maths today, and we have had 119 stories coming out of Myanmar and Bangladesh since August 25th this year. Videos, texts, shows, discussions. And why? Because there's an interest. People are interested in this story. And what Al Jazeera is doing in this case is not just parachuting in and going back out again. We've been covering this story since 2012. I remember Al Jazeera's Phil Rees did an investigation in 2013 called Hidden Genocide. Just a few days before incidents flared up in the Rakhine state, Al Jazeera World had something titled Silent Abuse, which was about what was going on in Myanmar towards the Rohingya. So it shows that Al Jazeera isn't a here today, gone tomorrow media entity. We've had people there for a considerable amount of time, and also we are continuing to have people there. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera's Jonah Hull is there, Nicholas Huck is there. We've just sent Al Jazeera's Annette Akin and Zahina Rashid to look at the situation of Roma refugees in these refugee camps, and it's something I think we'll be reporting not just for the next few days, but I think for a long time, for a few months ahead.
I'll give the last word.
If I may just jump in very quickly and talk about something that Shaukat said that really resonated with me, was the whole idea of that you go into these camps and people are expecting you to help. They expect some kind of difference. So when we were doing a story on sick children, we were walking around to a couple of tents and talking to people, and almost every single tent had a sick child or a sick adult.
Divya, we have about 15 seconds. Can I get you to sum that up?
My point, yeah, exactly. Well, my point was that, like Shaukat said, after we interviewed one of the tents, we were just surrounded by people from all the other tents in the camps asking us to talk to them because they believe that if we
Hassan
talk to
Patel,
them, they would
Rosalind
get some
Jordan,
help.
you'll find all of their work and more. All of our correspondents will be tweeting it out. You'll find it on stream.aljazeera.com as well. Thanks for joining the show today.